and presenters. I know to many of us, this isn't a PARCS convention that many of us have been accustomed to. The face-to-face swapping of stories, the reacquaintance of people met at previous conventions, the opportunity to meet new peers, and the general networking is just not going to be the same. It was a hard decision by the board to conduct the convention virtually, but after considering all factors, in the end, it was felt that for the safety of our members, it was better to be safe than sorry. We have 3 wonderful sessions lined up today, and we hope that you all registered for all of the sessions. So once again, welcome. Sit back in your comfortable recliner and get prepared to soak in all the knowledge you are about to hear from some very knowledgeable presenters. Thanks again for attending, and bear with us on any technical issues that we or yourself may have. So now I will hand it over to Chuck Deschamps to introduce our first session. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. So yes, so on behalf of PARCS and Ducks Unlimited Canada, we're very happy and pleased to be able to bring to you this session this morning on the importance of wetlands to resort communities. We have a number of speakers today, but before we get into that, just a little bit of housekeeping duties. Throughout this webinar, you're going to have the opportunity to ask questions. You can either do that at the end of each session by raising your hand in the toolbar there. You can raise your hand, or you'll see there's a chat question box. You can type your question in and then we'll read them. We are tight for time, so if we do happen to run out of time or not enough time for all the questions, you will have the ability, or we will send those questions on to PARCS and the presenters. So don't feel like your question will go unanswered. We're going to try to make every effort to get the questions and answers out there as well. So I guess with that, as I mentioned, we've got an excellent panel today, some very good researchers in terms of the programs and projects that they've been studying in Saskatchewan. These are Saskatchewan studies with very applicable information to what's happening in Saskatchewan right now. And we also have the pleasure of welcoming Sean Jacques, who's with the Water Security Agency, to talk about the current regulations and policies they're working on. So it should be an excellent session. So with that, I will start with our first presenter, who is Alice Davies. Alice is the Watershed Manager for the Lower Qu'Appelle Watershed Stewards group down in the Qu'Appelle Valley. She's a resident of the Qu'Appelle Watershed and resides in the lakeside village of Bird Point. She has worked with Cowessess First Nation and the Lands Department, and as a stewardship manager, she faces a lot of challenges with the 6 recreational lakes and is proud to be part of the changing the challenge along with her many friends from the Craven Dam to the Manitoba border. So with that, welcome, Alice.
Good morning, everyone. And you guys can all hear me?
Hear you good, Alice.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for inviting me to the PARCS convention, and no worries about not meeting in person. I think we can all sit back and relax and have our coffees and watch the show for today. So as Chuck mentioned, I'm from the Lower Qu'Appelle Watershed Stewards. Our office is located in Esterhazy, and I myself live at Round Lake. So the quality of lake water we have is extremely important to me as well. So we are one of 11 watershed groups here in Saskatchewan, And the watershed groups were developed in the province for the management and protection of the water resources for the benefit of Saskatchewan residents through representation of interests like RMs, First Nations, provincial and federal governments, and other interested groups. Substantial efforts are undertaken to identify threats to source waters and to provide a plan to address these threats. Each watershed in our province is unique, where our watershed is noted as an advocacy and a research group. So the Lower Qu'Appelle Basin is located in southeast Saskatchewan, forming the downstream half of the Qu'Appelle River Basin, starts near the town of Craven and ends at the Manitoba border. The river flows through 6 major lakes. They include Pasqua, Echo, Mission, Katepa, Crooked, and Round Lakes. We also have 16 towns, 29 villages, and 16 First Nations, and many resort villages, hamlets along our lakes. Economic activity includes agriculture, tourism, potash mining, oil and gas development, and they are all extremely important drivers in our watershed. Recreation-based tourism is another important support of our watershed economy, and this is particularly true here in our watershed. So our vision is a long-term, stable, high-quality water supply for people and for the environment. Water quality in the Lower Qu'Appelle Lakes will be able to support recreation, fishing, and economic development within the ecological limits of the system. The key components are, and these are identified by all of our stakeholders here in our watershed: water quality, quantity and flow, industry, upland water management, and wastewater management. So we all live in a watershed, and a watershed is an area of land that drains water or snow into one location, such as a stream, lake, or wetland. These water bodies supply our drinking water, water for ag and manufacturing, offer opportunities for recreation, and provide habitat for numerous plants, animals, and insects. Unfortunately, various forms of pollution, including runoff and erosion, can interfere with the health of our watershed. We have partnered with many stakeholders over the years to bring awareness and education and sharing the importance of protecting the quality of our watershed. So we all have a piece of land to manage, no matter where we live, or whether we live in a condo or a farm or a lakeside dwelling. We may be urban dwellers, ag producers, but we all have something in common, and that's managing the piece of land we live on. And we want to do our best at protecting our environment, our lakes, streams, rivers, and our very own backyards for us and for the future generations. So you see, even the turtles here have their own little piece of land to manage. So our concerns in our watershed is the water quality. Here in our watershed, water is used for many purposes, including environmental needs for the flora and fauna of the watershed, and the many human needs, including source water, recreation, industry, and agriculture. Our watershed, as determined by the 2010 State of the Watershed Report, is classified as stressed. This means that although our watershed has no degradation in function or the services it provides, it has simply lost resistance to change. Ag plays an important part in maintaining a healthy watershed. Within the Lower Qu'Appelle, a large portion of the land is dedicated to agricultural production. A reliable water supply is important in maintaining a sustainable ag industry. Ag invasive species and their spread is passed on through education and increased awareness and implementation of BMPs that are offered through the Ministry of Ag. Keeping wetlands on the land will slow water and remove many of the nutrients that would enter our rivers and lakes. Within our watershed, 69% of the land is cropped, increasing the risk of erosion and nutrient loading through increased inputs. Inputs can be reduced by using a variety of management tools such as variable rate technology, sectional control, and crop rotation. Recognizing that cattle have a significant effect on water quality and riparian areas, it is important to remove cattle and manure from entering surface water, like corral relocation, remote watering stations, and exclusion fencing and runoff controls. Working with producers and Water Security Agency, we continue to educate to ensure new wells are protected and old wells are properly decommissioned to protect the groundwater. Working with producers to educate and assist with implementing best management practices will reduce the environmental stressor and improve the overall watershed health. Wetlands, their health is such a critical factor in maintaining a healthy ecosystem. The hydrology functions of wetlands include storage and eventual release of surface water, recharge of local and regional groundwater supplies, reduction in peak floodwater flows, desynchronization of flood peaks, and erosion prevention. Our watershed has some of the highest densities of prairie pothole wetlands in the prairie pothole region. 3 areas in particular are the Touchwood Hills, the Beaver Hills, and the Pheasant Hills are all recognized by the North American Waterfowl Management Plan as being nationally important for breeding waterfowl. This is why it is so important to protect our wetlands, restore previously drained wetlands, and encourage and lobby our province to create and implement a wetlands policy. So we do have a nutrient problem. Scientists are telling us this, and we want to know what and why and where they're coming from. Adding phosphorus and nitrogen into a mix of nutrients that are keeping our water residents well fed year-round disrupts this balance. So where are they coming from? Well, sometimes it comes naturally from the soil or from decaying plant matter, but far too often it's coming from us. For example, look at our beautiful lush green lawns. Do we use fertilizer to keep ours looking nice? It's hard to imagine that we can have an impact on a water body the size of a lake, but we do. Scientists are also showing us that water runoff into our lakes, rivers, and streams also has a lot to do with excess nutrients getting in there. The lake kind of acts as a collecting bed for these nutrients and chemicals, because water flows across the ground from snow melt and heavy rains and collects in lakes. So what we do in our watershed on the land influences what happens to our water. And remember, according to the State of the Watershed report, our watershed is already stressed. So most of our runoff comes from snowmelt in the spring. At this time, soils are frozen and plants are dormant, so nutrients don't get used. They can only be stored or allowed to flow downstream. Wetlands store spring runoff and nutrients are removed when the plants grow later. Drainage removes the water storage function so nutrients flow downstream rather than being retained on the land. So now we can talk a little bit about cottage country. So over the years, and together with our lakeside dwellers, parks, resort villages, and all of our partners, we have successfully raised awareness on the use of fertilizers on our lawns, and removing railway ties as retaining walls and restoring our lakesides back to a more natural way for our aquatic habitat. Almost every resident in the district of Qu'Appelle has received the Qu'Appelle poplar tree. We also planted trees at Echo Provincial Park, the Echo Lake Bible Camp, and the Star Blanket First Nations. Did you know that a 10-year-old tree is estimated to absorb 48 pounds of CO2 each year, and a young tree absorbs an estimate of 13 pounds of CO2 a year. Imagine what a whole bunch of young trees could do. And we continue to plant trees every year, anywhere we can, to be able to collect the CO2 and to make our property more beautiful. So Love Your Lakes program, and I hope there's a few of you who know Love Your Lakes. It's been a province-wide program here. This program has enhanced with grant funding from the federal government Environmental Damages Fund. This is just within our watershed, and it was delivered to the district of Qu'Appelle. The program is a stewardship program that helps communities to ensure the health of their water. But most of all, this project raised awareness on healthy watershed living. We had a huge amount of volunteers to do this. We did shoreline assessments for each of the residents living along the lake. And the project wouldn't happen if we didn't have the volunteers that we needed to deliver this program. So projects like that wouldn't be possible without our partners driving the force. And why is that? Because they want to be more environmentally aware and ensure that our lakes that we live on or beside, used for our recreational purposes, are going to improve over time for our grandchildren and future generations. So it's important to me, and I know a lot of our lakeside dwellers here in our watershed, it's important to them, and they wanted to help, and they still continue to help to bring good things to their lakes. So Living Edges is where land and water meet and are the richest, most productive areas on Earth. Keeping your living edge natural will give you time to enjoy the uniqueness. The ribbon of life, while shorelines are different and fragile, we always haven't treated them with care. Because it feels good to be near the water, we have tended to build close to it, relying on our human ability to use technology to surmount nature's awesome power to erode and flood. We try to convert our piece of paradise into a tropical beach. Although beautiful lawns and flower beds look fantastic, a natural, undisturbed shoreline is healthy and performing all the many functions that shorelines are supposed to do.
Could I get you to wrap it up, Alice, please?
Yeah, we sure can. I just want to quickly go through to this here, municipal non-point source. As you can see, I don't know if you can see my my pointer, but as you can see, municipal non-point source in-stream nutrient loads, percentage shown on a plot quantify the 3-year average annual contribution of non-source nutrients. So it's really important, again, that we keep our wetlands on the land as homeowners, lakeside dwellers, whatever piece of land we live on, we need to remember that we need to manage that so our future generations can enjoy our lakes, rivers, and streams. So with that, I want to thank you all for inviting me to be part of this presentation, and I look forward to the rest of the day.
Thanks, Alice. That was very informational. I'm not seeing a lot. I'm not seeing really any questions at this point. I'm sure there will be some here later on, but due to time constraints, we'll move on to Dr. Peter Leavitt. So Peter is the founder and research chair of Canada's Institute of Environmental Change and Society. He's at the U of R, and he's also professor of biology there, and has published numerous research papers. The main themes of his papers include algae and bacteria as indicators of environmental change, how climate influences lakes and society, and ecosystem sustainability and management, and the interactive effects between humans and climate on lakes. So with that, Peter, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Chuck. Right, can people see my full screen here?
Yep, looks good.
Awesome. Okay, so I just want to start with an acknowledgement that a lot of the research I've been doing is on Treaty 4 territory, and some of the work I'm going to talk about is in Treaty 6. These were signed in the late 1800s as an agreement between the Crown and Indigenous people to share the land, and we haven't done a very good job on this, generally speaking, and I think we need to acknowledge that some of our policies as a country have been harmful to First Nations, and that we have an opportunity now to change the narrative and to move forward in a spirit of truth and reconciliation. So I was asked to talk about water quality in Saskatchewan. I thought, okay, well, that's a broad topic. And I'm going to fail right off the bat and just say I can't cover the whole province, but what I am going to talk about is the area in the southern third of the province, sort of from the boreal transition down to more or less the US border. And initially I thought, well, okay, what sort of things affect lakes here? And what I came up with was just in 10 minutes, and I'm sure this is not even remotely comprehensive, was a lot of things affect water quality or potentially affect water quality. This is an intensively managed habitat environment, and a lot of our actions have consequences. And so really the question is, what are those consequences? Like, where are we and how did we get here? And so in this talk, I'm going to sort of summarize some work we've done on the current status of lakes, mostly in the grasslands. I'm going to talk about some of the research we've done on why we've arrived at this condition, and then some looking forward, what we think might happen. And I tried to guess what other people were going to talk about, and so I'm trying to link up some of the things that Alice has talked about with what I think Helen and Colin and others will speak about later. So the question is, what's the water quality like now? And I am going to talk mostly about lakes here rather than wetlands per se. And the information is based on a couple of surveys that we've done. We're trying to do a survey of 100 lakes in southern Saskatchewan about every 10 years. So we've got another one scheduled for next year. And basically what we've done is we've gone out to a series of lakes and measured all the standard water quality parameters that we can. And we're trying to develop maps of what the province looks like, the southern part of the province looks like. A lot of this work is by Heather Sauer, who did her PhD with me and now works with the Water Security Agency, as well as Samantha Pham, who did a master's on this, helped out by Suzanne McGowan. So one of the things both groups did was use the chemical fingerprint of water to say, where does the water come from and do we have enough of it? And it's hard to go through this other than to say that the approach that we've taken is a fairly common one. And I've just put down 4 sort of take-home bullets here. The main thing in this region is that we have much more water lost by evaporation than we have arriving by precipitation and inflow. So we have not enough water to sustain the lakes in most years. When we ask where the water comes from, we find that it varies among years and with the climate. Typically, the source water is from snow after dry periods, droughts, typically in the summer, and from rain after pluvial periods or wet periods. Most of the lakes, or many of the lakes, are closed basin. That means water flows in, but it evaporates out rather than flowing out from the surface. And as a result, lake levels and water chemistry really bound around from one period of time to the next. And so one of the key characteristics of water in southern Saskatchewan is it's quite variable. When you start mapping things out, there are certain things that are really obvious. One is that the water is uniformly alkaline, that is, it has a high pH, and this is really right across the entire region. It looks like it's a little hotter in the north there than in the south, but the reality is the scale's pretty compressed. These are all alkaline systems, and that is a common feature to all of the lakes. About a third, well, about a half of the lakes would be considered salty or saline according to government definitions, which is more than 3 grams of total salts per liter. This is not evenly distributed. Mostly this is in the western half of the grasslands, sort of towards Alberta, rather than in the east. Some of these sites are not particularly salty, but a fair fraction of them here, about 10 lakes, are actually quite, more salty than the ocean. And I've got Chaplain Lake there as an example. Pretty much most of the grassland lakes have relatively poor water clarity. That is, the light penetration isn't that great. And so here I've just got a plot of how far light penetrates, from just a few centimeters up to tens of meters. And you can see on the map on the right that it's mostly blue, meaning that light transparency is somewhere between 0 and 1 meter through most of the grasslands. So the water's fairly murky in most of the lakes. Now, there are exceptions, but when you map it out at the landscape scale, water quality is not so great. There's a bunch of reasons why the water is not particularly clear, and I've just put 3 of them here. There's more. I just couldn't graph them that well. One of them is about half of the lakes have very high concentrations of algae and cyanobacteria. So they have very green appearance, and we call these lakes eutrophic lakes. And you can see in green, about half of the distribution of lakes have very high levels of chlorophyll. That's the color that gives trees and algae in that. It's green color. It's just a pigment. But you can see some of these values are very high, and the definition of eutrophic is really over 30 micrograms a liter. Similarly, when you look at the nutrient content here with total phosphorus, at least 20 to 25% of the lakes are characterized as eutrophic, some extremely so, with even 1 milligram of phosphorus per liter, really astronomically high compared to many lakes. And then at least some of the lakes have relatively low transparency because they have very high concentrations of dissolved organic matter. Now, we typically don't see this really brown stained color in the grasslands. I think that probably turbidity, suspended sediments in these shallower lakes is an issue as well. But there's multiple features that are producing this lack of clarity, lack of transparency in the water. One of the things that a lot of people are worried about, though, is that not only do we have lots of algae, but the algae themselves typically have a high proportion of cyanobacteria. So in the most recent survey we did, we looked at the concentrations of microcystin, a common cyanobacterial toxin, and about half of the lakes, the good news is about half of the lakes were below World Health Organization thresholds. Unfortunately, the other half typically were greater than that, meaning that there was a sort of a recreational, consumption rather, advisory. 4 of the 5 of the sites, however, seen here with these large circles in the map, these are sites where the concentration of the toxin was so high as to present an acute risk to human health. So that means you really shouldn't get anywhere near the water. And the fact that these sites exist in the prairies is worrying. And you can see that the distribution of the larger circles, the higher toxin levels, is pretty even across the grasslands. So if we summarize, then we've got lakes that are relatively alkaline, fair number that are salty, a fair number that are very green, and the greenness arises because, excuse me, a fair number that are not very transparent. And that is because of high densities of algae, a fair number of which are toxic. So we have a condition now, and the question is, well, how did we get here? Like what's the issue here? So for this, I'm going to summarize some of the research that we've been doing on the Capel system for the last 30-ish years. And we've taken really 3 main approaches, two really convincing ones, and then one that we're just starting. The first one is we've just been monitoring the lakes, and we do things like look at the chemical materials and the physical properties of the lakes. We look at the biology in the system, and we try and map out how these lakes compare with other lake types and get some idea of what the modern condition is. So very much like the survey we did, but instead of doing it once a decade, we do it every 2 weeks for 30 years. So we've got a reasonably robust data set here. The second approach that we take is to let the lakes tell us what they think has happened. Here we take sediment cores, mud, tubes of mud out of the bottom of the lake, and we cut them into intervals. And basically, the deeper you go, the older the material is. And these lakes have been here for thousands of years. And so you can drive back centuries to millennia if you so fit, if you so wish. And you can see all sorts of things. There's fossils of algae, there's biochemical fossils, there's environmental DNA in the sediments, and they allow you to tell or reconstruct histories of water quality change. Here's a record of how salty Humboldt Lake has been over the last 2,000 years. The third thing that we're doing, and this is in conjunction with Helen Baulch, who'll speak later, as well as the Water Security Agency, is we're basically trying to take advantage of some of the new platforms for Earth sensing, particularly the satellites, and get a better idea of what the historical change is in a broader suite of lakes. And so Landsat images go back to the 1980s, and if you calibrate them with real-time data, you can get a sense of what the change in water quality has been. This is far easier said than done, but it's a project that is ongoing, as I say, in collaboration with a number of groups, including the University of Waterloo, who really are the experts in the remote sensing. So what we've learned is the water quality, like many of the grassland lakes, is relatively poor. We have high alkalinity, high nutrients, lots of cyanobacteria, and the cyanobacteria are pretty much all the flavors. And I refer to them as Annie, Fanny, and Mike. Their names have changed a little bit through time, but Anabaena, Phanosomenon, and Microcystis, they're the ones that typically form a lot of the toxin-producing blooms that we see in the Capel system. So how did we get here? Well, when we use the sediments to tell us about the history of the lakes, we can look at the headwater systems in the upper Capel or the lower Capel. There's certain things that you see. And the first one is that the water quality started degrading pretty much at the same time as widespread agriculture entered the catchment. So we went back and reconstructed the history of land use in the system, and we can show that with the advent of farming in the catchment, we do see a modest degradation in water quality. I will say, though, it's not a tremendous degradation. Initially, there were a lot of changes in the lakes, but they weren't necessarily indicative of particularly poor water quality. When we look at a number of other lakes and we take sediment cores, we can sort of compare the surface of the sediments, which is now, and go back down about a meter into the mud, which is sort of like a couple of hundred years ago, and look at the ratio and just ask, well, have things basically gotten better or worse? And you see lakes that have done a little bit of each. You see changes in nutrient supply. Some have been worse. The modern conditions much more nutrient rich than the historical one. Others are quite a bit better. But when you map it out, it's really quite interesting. You see that the eastern lakes typically have shown significant increases in nutrients, and those same lakes have shown substantial increases in cyanobacteria, suggesting a common mechanism underlying them. But the thing that is probably most notable about these historical reconstructions is how much the water quality degradation has accelerated in the last 70-odd years, particularly since 1950. So again, one of the questions is why? Some of this is due to urban pollution. We know that the wastewater from the city of Regina trickles down into the Wascana Creek and the Capel and has an effect on the downstream lakes. We can show that the increase in nutrient pollution has a direct relationship with how green the lake is, and we can reconstruct that over centuries using the sediment record, and we can validate those interpretations by doing experiments where we show that nitrogen, particularly from the city of Regina, has had a degrading effect on water quality, much more so than phosphorus, mostly because there's so much phosphorus in the system, you really can't add any more and have any effect. We can also show that the upgrade of the wastewater treatment plant has made things better. If you compare the water quality immediately downstream of the wastewater plant to that immediately upstream, and then look before and after the wastewater treatment plant, you find that before we improved the wastewater treatment plant, basically the input of wastewater degraded the system, whereas now it is actually improving the system. So we're seeing direct evidence that the upgrade is improving the water quality in these systems. The lakes are not quite as convincing, and in fact, you could look at that and go, well, this is horrible. The lower Capel is really showing significant degradation. And what this is just I've measured how much of the greenness actually floats on the surface relative to the total amount in the water. So this is whether you're seeing a bloom or a scum on the surface of the lake. And so the higher the number is, the scummier it is, and the lower it is, the less scummy it is. So what you see though is that there has been this step up in the influence of these blooms, but that it precedes the effects of the wastewater treatment plant. And we've shown through other studies that this is a climatic signal. If you look at the satellite data, you can look at a lot more lakes and you see basically the same pattern, that there's been a change in the water quality. And you can actually compare amongst all the lakes at once. And the thing that jumps out is that they all changed about 1990. And this is important because in 1990, we see lots of evidence at the prairies of climate effects on the systems. Increased precipitation in the east led to more nutrient runoff and degradation, and really the significant degradation of Lake Winnipeg. We're starting to see some evidence that that might be also true in the Capel system. This is important because it means that the baseline values that we use now are not really a good baseline, that the system is already significantly degraded. We can look at climate effects here, and I'm just going to skip through this very quickly. Using the same sort of data, we see relatively few directional changes in water quality over the last 30 years, large differences among lakes, and some evidence of cycles. There's lots of factors that affect water quality, and whether you're looking at the total greenness of the lake, whether it's high cyanobacteria or low water quality, or whether it's forming a surface scum, you see many, many factors. And so we did a number of models to try and figure out what the important features of this were. And here's the upshot. As it gets warmer, we get more greenness, more algae in the water, and more surface scum. And this is a very strong effect. We expect between a 3 and 5 degrees Celsius increase in the region in the next 50 years, and that should approximately double the amount of algae in the system, all else being equal. We see pretty strong evidence that reducing nutrient inputs will improve the water quality. The more you reduce it, the better the water quality will become. And the magnitude of change is about the same as the magnitude of effect of climate change. We don't see much evidence of water management being a big deal, that you can put more or less water through the system, but there's so many sources of nutrients that the solution to pollution is not dilution in this particular case. So to finish up then, where are we going looking forward? Well, like I said, we're looking at a warmer future, and this is pretty much a done deal at this point. It's not a manageable issue. We can make that number lower rather than higher by controlling our greenhouse gas emissions. But at the end of the day, the prairies are in for quite a bit warmer environment. And we know warmer means more algae, more cyanobacteria, potentially more toxic production. We could also look at production from a producer's perspective, and here's just a little bit of data from the Canadian wheat production, an estimate of what our total potential yield, if everything were perfect, could be, and the actual yield. And you can see we've got some scope for improvement. We can maybe add another 20% to total production if we have the right varieties of wheat production. I will say this is the Canadian aggregate. The Saskatchewan data, they'll look very similar. But the key point is that if you look at production of wheat since 1960s, it's pretty much a linear function of the subsidies of nutrients that we put into the soils. The more you put in, the more you get. And so the question is, will we be able to control the amount of fertilizer we add and how much will leak into the system? Most of this fertilizer will be as urea, which is an organic form of nitrogen, and we expect it to about double in the next 30 years. And Saskatchewan already leads the nation in the use of urea. About 60-odd%, maybe 65% of total nitrogen application to farmlands is as urea. This is the key point. Recent research that we've done in farm wetlands with the cooperation of producers shows unambiguously that when you add urea to wetlands, it will degrade them. Now, we're not adding anything else, just urea to fairly standard farm dugouts. Now, to the extent that these mimic real wetlands, maybe we could step back and be a little cautious here, but we can see that there's a degradation of water quality. We're getting much more chlorophyll, really enormous numbers, and our unaffected or reference systems don't change. And all the types of algae do, the diatoms, the cryptophytes, the cyanobacteria, they all step up. The other thing that happens is these systems get stripped out of oxygen and become uninhabitable by salamanders and amphibians and fish. So to conclude then, I think we can see that water quality in Saskatchewan has some work. We have generally high levels of water stress, pH, salinity, nutrient content, etc. The cyanobacteria increased with some, with the advent of agriculture, but it's really accelerated in the last 60 to 70 years due to a combination of point source, urban, and agricultural pollution with nitrogen, among other nutrients. Climate warming is going to make it worse, but the key point is, I think, looking forward, we expect that these factors will interact, and we might be looking at as much as 3 or 4-fold, 400% more algae in many of the lakes with associated elevated toxins and depleted oxygen concentration. So with that, I will finish up.
Thanks, Peter. That was an excellent talk and some interesting information that we should really take to heart and think about when we're talking about nutrient loading and land use. I'm not seeing any questions at this point. If people have questions, as I mentioned, you can raise your hand or type something in the chat.
People can also email me later if they want. It's just peter.leavitt@uregina.ca, and I'm happy to field questions if something occurs to you later.
Excellent. And when we also will, if anybody has any questions or whatever that come into PARCS, we will definitely forward those on as well. So in the essence of time here, I think we'll continue to move on. So next up, we have Helen. Helen Baulch is an associate professor at the University of Saskatchewan with the School of Environmental Sustainability and the Global Institute for Water Security. Her research centers on issues of water quality and water security in the prairies, and her teaching covers broad issues of sustainability, and including sustainability of water resources. So with that, welcome, Helen, and the webinar is all yours.
Great. Well, thanks for having me today. And like Peter, I spent some time sort of predicting what I thought other folks would talk about. And I'm going to hone in on the water quality and wetlands piece with appreciation for Alice and Peter, who have really set the stage here. So like Peter, I'm going to focus on the prairie component, but many of the same insights will be relevant further north. And I'll just take a moment to acknowledge huge number of people have contributed to aspects of the work I'll present here, as well as important funding agencies. So as mentioned, I work in what's called the Global Institute for Water Security, and we spend a lot of time thinking about what water security is. And I think Alice touched on some of these ideas earlier, but what we're thinking about is, you know, a reliable supply of water of acceptable quantity and quality for health, livelihoods, ecosystems, and production. So including agriculture and including our drinking water needs, including the needs of ecosystems, and then acceptable levels of water-related risks. And those water-related risks are ones that in the prairies we're often very familiar with in terms of drought and flooding, but we're certainly becoming increasingly familiar with these water quality-related risks. So as Peter articulated, water quality in prairie lakes is often relatively poor, and these are old headlines, you know, from years back when I first generated this slide, but certainly you could go back and find more or less the same headlines for a whole variety of lakes across the province for this past year. So it's a pretty significant issue. And as Peter noted, you know, there is widespread evidence that we're getting worse water quality and increased frequency of blooms. It's not everywhere, but it's a common issue a worsening issue in the prairies and across much of the world. And as he noted, this is really driven by a couple factors that interact. One is increased nutrient loading, and the other is these climatic changes that affect lake temperatures. So we know prairie lakes are typically relatively shallow, which means they're relatively warm in the summer, and they're naturally fairly nutrient rich. So our lakes underwent these blooms naturally, but certainly warming and added nutrients has made this risk worse. So what we see is moving, as we add nutrients to lakes, we tend to move from these clearer water conditions towards the right into these cloudy water conditions that can lead to issues of, for example, winter fish kills, and those risks of toxic algae that Peter articulated are a real concern across many of our lakes. Now, the drivers of these nutrient inputs, there's several of them. There are natural sources, but certainly the changes that we're seeing relate to sewage and urban runoff, but the biggest driver across all of our lakes tends to be those agricultural inputs. And that's what I'll focus on for today. And I think what I want to articulate right off the outset is that this is a big problem. It's a problem we've known about for a very long time, but we don't have solutions in hand because it's a very, very hard problem. And it's related to both an incredible sensitivity of lakes to nutrient inputs. For example, lakes respond to phosphorus in parts per billion quantities. So very small changes can really have an impact on a lake ecosystem. And when we look at addressing that on an agricultural input side, that's really tricky. And I'll draw your attention to the graph here, which shows basically a detailed nutrient budget across 2 farm fields. And you can see all the things coming in and out. And all I really want you to do is try to see that purple line. And many of you may say there is no purple line in most years. And that's actually the point. The runoff purple line is the phosphorus losses from those fields. Now, those phosphorus losses are actually really, really small in the context of those agricultural nutrient budgets, but those phosphorus losses are enough to contribute to eutrophication, these nutrient pollution problems in downstream ecosystems. So it's a really challenging problem to address because agronomically, these phosphorus losses aren't important, but environmentally, they're very important. Now, today's focus is wetlands. And I think, as we all know, wetlands are a defining feature of the prairie landscape. And I love flying in and out of Saskatoon or looking around on Google Maps, and you see this. They're a really important feature of the landscape. So if we step back and think about what is a wetland, it's an ecosystem with waterlogged soils and distinct vegetation. And it's important to note that they are diverse. So they can be these ponds that will all sort of circle on these maps and say, yeah, that's a wetland. But they can also be something more akin to a puddle that only holds water for a period of weeks, but has some very important ecological functions. So wetlands have very different and important ecological functions. Now, if we're going to focus on water quality, and if we're recognizing we need to control nutrient loads, there are 3 key things we need to think about. The first is that we know wetlands are hotspots of nutrient cycling. They hold nutrients within them, and they can keep those nutrients from moving downstream. Perhaps a more important function is wetlands are a key area of water storage. So that means when we have more wetlands in the landscape, we can hold more water and less water is moving into downstream ecosystems. And that's important because that water always holds nutrients. So the amount of nutrient load moving downstream is roughly proportional to that amount of water moving downstream. And then the last point is a bit of a tricky one, but the key point is that we know in the prairie landscape, not all of the landscape actually contributes to flow in a normal year. But as we increase the connectivity of the landscape by draining wetlands and adding ditches to the landscape, we're adding to the area of the landscape that's contributing water and nutrients downstream. So that can have a really important impact because we know that those loads are roughly proportional to the size of the watershed. So again, more connectivity in the landscape, more nutrients downstream. Now, of course, if we're talking about the role of wetlands in the landscape, we are thinking about drainage. And drainage of surface water is a hot topic, certainly in the prairies. It's a really important one. And I'll start by recognizing that drainage of surface water has been ongoing in the prairies for more than 100 years. You know, it's noted the extensive drainage in the journals of the Palliser expedition. So it's been ongoing for a very long time. It increases arable land, it saves time for producers, and it's been argued that many areas of the prairies wouldn't be arable without drainage. So it's an important economic tool for the prairies. We also know that a large proportion of natural wetland coverage has been lost, at least 40 to 70% by area, and we may have some better numbers coming up, but certainly much higher proportion lost in some areas. And we know that this wetland drainage has significant complex environmental and societal costs and benefits. So if we again focus on the water quality aspect, this is a paper that a group of us wrote, really trying to synthesize what we know about the science of the impacts and benefits of wetland drainage in the prairies. And focusing in on water quality, you know, again, we know that wetlands are hotspots of nutrient cycling. So that means that loss of wetlands decreases nutrient retention capacity. We know that wetlands are key areas of water storage. So that means that more water tends to move downstream if we drain them, and with that, more nutrients. And again, for contributing area, we know that drainage increases that connected area and can increase nutrient loads downstream. So those three mechanisms are important in influencing the role of wetlands and the impact of drainage on nutrient transport. And the magic question is, how much of an impact does that have? And the answer is very complex because it depends on the details of agricultural practice in the landscape, the structure of the landscape, how wet the year is, and so on. But the answer is, in some areas, it's a very important impact. So if we completely drain the landscape, we'd see at least a doubling or a tripling of nutrient export. Of course, we're not talking about that extent of drainage in most landscapes going forward, but if we consider the historic impacts, almost certainly this has had an important influence on these water quality issues that we see. So the summary is that wetland drainage has and will increase nutrient export by affecting chemistry, contributing area, and flow. So if we go back to overarching questions of water quality, we know that lakes respond to these very small changes in nutrient concentrations. We know that wetlands are important in retaining nutrients and water, and that drainage can have substantive negative impacts on water quality by increasing nutrient loading. And on the whole, I'd say water quality news in the prairies isn't very good. And I will say that I think we keep making decisions for other very good reasons, but not focused on water quality. So we know that reduced tillage has had huge uptake across the prairies and is fantastic for soil carbon, soil moisture, and for producers. It's actually very negative for water quality. And the same is true for perennial forage and cover crops. So very negative impacts are expected in the prairies on water quality. We also know that most trapping BMPs, like riparian buffer strips, really aren't very effective in nutrient retention in our landscape. They have other benefits to habitat and so on, but they're not very effective in nutrient retention because snowmelt is when all that nutrient tends to move, and those BMPs really aren't alive at that time of year. So given that sensitivity of lakes, I would argue we really need to think hard about what we can do on the water quality side. So coming back to that idea of water security and water quality, clearly a really important interest to likely everyone on the call here. I think it's important to keep in mind that role of wetlands in water quality, that sensitivity of our lakes, and as Peter notes, you know, that growing sensitivity as our lakes warm. And one area I'm really thinking about is this challenge of managing agricultural inputs as perhaps one of the best ways to help mitigate impacts on downstream ecosystems. And we are working on some research that suggests we can actually decrease phosphorus inputs into the landscape without impacting yields. Anyway, I will pass on here and take any questions.
Thanks, Helen. Another excellent presentation. Again, if you have questions, by all means, put your hand up or type something into the chat box. I'm currently not seeing anything at the moment. We've got a very quiet audience today, but that's okay. We are sort of keeping right on track on time. So I think with that, we'll move on to our next panelist, which is Colin Whitfield. Colin, like Helen, is also at the U of S. He is an assistant professor with the School of Environment and Sustainability with the Global Institute for Water Security. He's interested in understanding how pressures from human activities influence water resources and ecosystems, particularly at the watershed scale, and working with partner organizations to develop solutions to these challenges. So with that, Colin, the webinar is all yours.
All right, thanks a lot, Chuck. Can you see my screen okay?
It's a white screen at the moment.
Huh, okay.
There we go. Oh. We're seeing a Word document right now.
How about now?
There we go. Perfect.
All right, sorry about that. Thanks very much for the introduction, Chuck, and also the opportunity to speak today. So my colleagues have really done an excellent job preparing you guys for what I'm about to talk about. And so I'm going to try to connect some of the ideas we've heard about with respect to lakes and water quality and the role of wetlands into maybe a broader idea about thinking about wetlands beyond nutrients and water quality and just how valuable they are on the landscape. Before I do that, I just want to acknowledge that I'm joining today from Treaty 6 territory and traditional homeland of the Métis, and so I will pay my respects to the ancestors of these lands, but also acknowledge that some of the work that I talk about goes beyond the borders of Treaty 6 territory. I also want to acknowledge that a little bit of the work that I'll talk about today is really a collaborative effort of a large number of people, and so I've listed some of those who've had a strong hand in the work here, but also acknowledge that this is part of a larger project where we're heavily engaged with partner organizations from across the Prairie provinces, and so they've influenced the direction of the work we've taken and have been really instrumental in guiding both some of the research questions that we're trying to answer, but also the means by which we're going about doing that. So I don't need to say much about water on the prairies because that's really been covered well thus far, but I do want to emphasize that this is a region of extremes and always has been, and so adaptation has been part of the culture. Certainly what we want to try to better understand is how the impacts that we're having, perhaps directly, in the case of wetland drainage perhaps, or indirectly through things like climate change, what impacts those are having and how we might adapt to those types of impacts. And so we're trying to answer some questions around both the impacts that our actions are having, but how we might better govern our actions and try to make some predictions about the behavior of the biophysical system and also how that links back to practices on the landscape. So before I get too far, I want to just try to conceptualize resilience for everyone, because obviously this is a strong feature of my talk, thinking about resilience and how wetlands are part of a resilient system. So when we think about resilience, we're thinking about the linkages between humans and environment and how those systems can respond to change. So what's their capacity to respond to change? And so I've illustrated this here. If we think about the behavior of the system as being this red circle, at time 1, we might have a stressor or a shock on this system. This could be an economic shock. It could be introduction of an invasive species perhaps, or maybe a climate change. And it can change or potentially change the behavior of the system. And so that will drive us away from that starting point. And in a resilient system, we'll expect that with time, we can respond to those shocks or those stresses and return to something similar to where we started. And so this is really important, is that in a system that has high resilience, multiple or large stressors are required to change the system state. Smaller ones it will respond to, but maintain its behavior. Conversely, we can think about a system that has lower resilience. So here you'll notice the size of that arrow moving from time point 1 to time point 2 is much smaller. So this is a smaller shock, but yet in a system with less resilience, we're able to drive the system with small stressors in a way that results in a fundamentally different state. So this is really important when we think about the role of wetlands. They offer many functions that help to provide a resilient human environment system in the prairies. So one of the challenges, I think I don't need to say a lot here, but one of the challenges when we're trying to understand the system and make predictions is that the landscape doesn't have a strong connectivity in the way that other landscapes do because of the role of wetlands. So we have water that goes to lakes, the terminal lakes that Peter talked about, or to wetlands and goes back to the atmosphere. So it becomes hard to say something about the region as a whole because we can't necessarily do it with ways like hydrometric networks to observe things like stream flow, because the landscape, much of it, all that area shown in orange, doesn't connect on a regular basis. The second thing is that we can monitor things intensively, but we can't necessarily extrapolate from one place to another. So there's lots of places where lake basins or watersheds have been studied in detail, but we don't know how we can extrapolate from those to the broader region. So we've tried to approach this by developing a watershed classification. So we have classified watersheds across the prairies, about 4,000 of them. These are small watersheds, about 100 kilometers in area, 100 square kilometers. And there are 7 of them shown by the different colors there. And I'm really going to focus on the one we see in light blue, which we call the pothole till, which spans a large area across Saskatchewan. So what we want to do is think about the behavior of different watershed classes and understand how they might respond to stressors like climate change or like wetland drainage. And so I'll focus on a few examples of wetland drainage, but also show some of our work on climate. So firstly, so the map up there on the right shows that pothole till class that spans the largest chunk of the prairie ecozone that we've mapped and classified. How does stream flow respond if we drain wetlands? So on this chart here, what we have are different amounts of stream flow on an annual basis on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis, we have the return period. And so the blue line represents a historical or condition with no wetland loss. As we remove wetlands, we have a large increase in the amount of runoff that will be given for the same level of precipitation. So stream flow events that were once uncommon or very rare, things that might have happened every 40 years, are now projected to happen every 3 years on average. So that water storage feature of wetlands is incredibly important. It regulates the amount of volume that comes off the landscape. And as we remove wetlands, we remove that storage capacity, which results in more efficient runoff generation, means higher levels of stream flow, higher amounts of runoff to downstream ecosystems. This is important, of course, for the reasons that Helen described. When we remove those wetlands, they're unable to store that water. And when we increase the amount of water, we increase the amount of nutrients that move to our downstream ecosystems and potentially result in bloom events or degrading water quality. And many of those systems we rely on for drinking water. Thirdly, biodiversity. So we've modeled the response of biodiversity as we remove wetlands from the landscape. And what this chart here shows is the amount of wetland drained in our scenarios. So we remove them in 10% increments from 0 all the way up to complete wetland removal. And we link this to what we know about the behavior of different biota, in this case, wetland obligate bird species. And the vertical axis there shows the number of wetland birds present. If we remove 20% of the wetland, our estimates suggest that we'll lose more than 50% of the riparian bird abundance for these systems. And we have similar conclusions for other biota as well, other wetland species like dabbling ducks and vertebrates. We're really removing the habitat that these are critically important for a wide diversity of animals when we remove wetlands. And so this is the most sensitive parameter if we're talking about wetland drainage or removal of wetlands. Biota is showing the largest, the strongest response to drainage. Okay, just quickly on stream flow and climate. This map shows some of our projections, thinking about how much stream flow could change under a warmer climate. And so the color there shows from light yellow to dark orange or red, the percent change per degree of warming, percent change in our stream flow. And so you can see a few features there. All of that area that we've mapped has a notable response. So somewhere between 7 and about 15% change per degree of warming, of which we've probably undergone at least 1 degree already. And we're projected to go through another 1 to 2 by the end of this century. So we see notable changes in the stream flow associated with climate warming. Of course, I want to acknowledge that climate will change in other ways beyond the temperature. It's a little bit harder to nail down what that will look like because there's a lot more uncertainty in the levels of precipitation, and it could be a little bit wetter or it could be a little bit less precipitation. The second thing is that you'll note that there's some strong contrast in that map, and that's related to the different wet watershed classes. And so some of those classes are more sensitive to changes in climate with respect to stream flow. And so we'll see an amplified response for some of those. Okay, so coming back to this idea of resilience as I wrap up my last few minutes here, if we think about the role of wetlands and the multitude of things that they do in terms of biodiversity, in terms of regulating stream flow and large deluge events on the prairies, we can think about a prairie landscape with wetlands as being one of high resilience. And as we remove them, particularly if we remove them in large numbers, as moving towards a much less resilient human environment system in the region. They won't be able to respond to stressors in the same way as if we have large numbers of them providing many of those services that I've articulated. So we can think about these things as all being important. They're gatekeepers for water. They're going to regulate the amount of runoff, particularly in flood conditions or during spring snow melt. They're important sinks for nutrients, as we heard from the previous speakers as well. They're hotspots of biodiversity, and they probably will play an increasing role with respect to moderating climate extremes. We will see more extremes, both in terms of drought and in terms of large precipitation events or flood events as we move further into a new climate. And wetlands play an important role in helping to moderate against some of those events. It's also important to acknowledge that diversity is really key to resilience, and so wetlands across our landscape provide some of that diversity and help to contribute to a resilient landscape. And of course, if we think about the ecosystem goods and services, the things like water storage and nutrient retention and biodiversity, these are necessary for a healthy economy, one that features a resilient human environment system. And so it's really important that we think carefully about wetlands and make informed decisions about whether or not to drain them, both in agricultural settings, but also the type of drainage that sometimes occurs through urbanization. So I will end there. Thanks very much for joining us today and allowing us the opportunity to speak. And I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Thanks, Colin. I see we do have a couple questions, and I think they're probably applicable to all of our panelists so far. So if anybody wants to jump in, by all means. One quick question is, what is the difference between a point source and a non-point source for nutrients?
Certainly, I can jump in there, I guess. I see Helen's got her camera on as well. So a point source is something like a effluent from a wastewater treatment plant, where we have a defined point at which a high level of pollution is being emitted, versus something like runoff from an agricultural field, which might exit in many different directions and be running off all or many parts of the landscape. So one is very concentrated at a location, that would be a point source, and the other would be a more diffuse source that's spread across the landscape.
Great. And one last question here. Later today or this morning, we will hear from Sean with the Water Security Agency about the current policy regulations under development regarding wetland drainage. But there's a question here in terms of the role or your involvement, and again, this goes out to all of our panelists so far, in terms of, are the universities and the research that you guys are doing being shared with water security, and are you involved in the consultations on this policy development?
Yes, so I guess I could say one thing about that and let others jump in as well. Certainly our work, we've had a strong dialogue with the Water Security Agency. Some of that information I shared today has been featured in some of the planning that they're doing, particularly for things like drought planning for small communities. And I know that the consultation is picking up steam at this stage. There have been some meetings that some of my colleagues have attended, and I expect that will continue over the next number of months as this process picks up. So yes, short answer, yes, we have a dialogue, we're sharing our research with them, and we hope that it can help to inform the process, particularly around the development of a wetland policy for the province.
Maybe be a little bit less optimistic. I think I agree with Colin that we share the science. I'm less, after decades living here, less optimistic about how it gets used. And I think the consultation has been minimal at this point with many groups. There's a wetlands policy that's going to be announced, and we'll probably hear about that later today, and it's embedded in an agricultural water policy. And this is like putting the fox in with the hens. I'm not certain necessarily that you're going to get a desirable outcome if you're going to immediately start mixing in the two. The other way to look at it is, of course, because it is ag that's doing the most of the draining, you pretty much have to have them together in order to get a resolution that is workable on a number of different fronts. But I would be, as I say, fairly critical of WSA at this point. I don't think the consultation has been up to scratch.
Okay, thanks for your answers to that question. So with that, we'll move into our next panelist. Our next panelist is Michael Champion. Michael is with Ducks Unlimited Canada. He is the head of industry and government relations and is based in the Regina office. He has a Ag. He's an agrologist, professional agrologist, and his efforts focus on wetland policy. Prior to taking on this role, Michael was involved with conservation programming with Ducks Unlimited, so working with farmers and ranchers on the ground in terms of developing sustainable programs for those producers, as well as he conducted range health assessments in the former PFRA pastures and facilitated grassland reclamation. So with that, Michael.
Thank you, Chuck. Yeah, and I've had the pleasure of working with Chuck for close to 20 years now, so very good. And thank you everyone for attending here. I'm going to turn off my webcam so I'm not distracted by staring at myself. Much like the other presenters, they've laid the, I did a little bit of pre-work on thinking what people might be talking about. The presenters before me did a very good job of kind of laying out the issue of wetland loss and some of the risks associated with wetland loss. And I'd like to present today on how Ducks Unlimited is working with those land managers on addressing the issue of wetland loss and some of the programming that we have developed here to address that issue. A little bit about us, we've been around since 1938, heavily involved in habitat management from our inception, and have moved more recently into upland habitat, and that's where I've focused my career has been on the upland management, moving away from large wetland projects and into grassland and small wetland projects. And again, started in the Dust Bowl of the Great Depression. The company was founded by waterfowlers to put water back on the landscape for hunting purposes, and we have now evolved into working with farmers, ranchers, and First Nations communities on maybe a bigger picture approach to land management in the province. And we do have our own research branch, the Institute of Wetland and Waterfowl Research, based out of Manitoba, where we focus on things ranging from grazing cycles on grassland and how that impacts waterfowl nesting success, to more recently looking at the carbon debate and trying to find solutions that will help monetize these habitats that farmers and ranchers in the province are managing, and having science really direct our business day to day. And the most recent example, I think, setting aside the carbon discussion because that's evolving. We used to not manage our property at all, thinking that it was better to leave our lands idle and let that be alone for waterfowl nesting. Did some research with grazing trials and found out that livestock and waterfowl coexist very well in the landscape, which is probably intuitive to a lot of people given the history of bison grazing in Saskatchewan or the prairies. But that's just an example of the adaptation we make once we have the science to support our decision making locally. So we're focused on the future in a big way, and we see a very big challenge that's set before us that the provincial, federal government, and international community is going to have to address, and that is this growing population globally here. With the UN estimating we're going to have just shy of 10 billion people here in 30 years. We have increased wealth in developing world, which puts pressure on commodities, and we're estimated that we're going to need to increase 70 to 100%, have an increase in food demand. So that's the challenge. And how do we grow and meet that challenge while still meeting that demand for food, helping our farms be profitable, but not at the expense entirely of our environment? Question is, how do we grow more food without using more land? And normally this is where we'd take a left-hand turn and talk about intensification on the ag landscape, and talk about for our nutrient management and GMO technology. And you know, and I think those are good. They're good things to focus on. Probably not the right time today to talk about that. So I'll just go into some of the duck programming that we offer for, like I say, for farms, ranches, and First Nations communities. And we work with the entire community in Saskatchewan. So if you're managing land and in one of our target areas, we are more than happy to work with you on whether it's winter wheat or grazing management, stock water development for livestock sector. We've got a very successful forage program, and then we have a purchase and easement program as well. And these do help. They will help cottage community indirectly, because we're going to be putting habitat on the ground. And notwithstanding the fact that the bulk of the nutrients do travel in the spring thaw over frozen ground, and maybe our properties aren't assimilating as many nutrients as we'd like to think they are, they do act as a bit of a catchment. And I think these natural areas do have, as Helen said, like they have other benefits as well, even if the nutrient management side isn't necessarily 100% where we'd like it to be. Focusing on maybe for our nutrient management, right place, right time, right product, is very helpful. But just some stats for in Saskatchewan, we know that in the grassland habitat, you'll get 50 to 100 different plant species occupying a quarter section of land. And on that same quarter section land, you'll have hundreds, if not thousands, of different animal species occupying that property, from frogs to deer to insects. So, and then of course the birds, which is where ducks is focused on. But very critical that these habitats provide for wildlife. 30 species at risk make their home in Saskatchewan grasslands, and over 60 species at risk in Canada are grassland designate birds. We know that grassland birds are on a decline, about 87% decline since 1907, largely driven by habitat loss. And why Ducks Unlimited is kind of passionate about upland habitat is this is where we find these small wetlands embedded in the landscape. And the grassland and wetland habitats, we know they sequester billions of tons of carbon. Ducks is working with the government, both provincially and federally, to try and find solutions to get carbon markets developed that'll put real money in the pockets of land managers to protect and restore, conserve these habitats. I think that kind of hammers the point that we need real policy objectives to deal with this issue. And then just a nice slide. I think Helen and Peter have done a really good job of going over what a wetland is, but you get it, everything from the small little cup, as I think Helen described, that holds water just very temporarily, to the lakes that Alice lives on. And one of the new programs that Ducks is delivering is a Project Dragonfly. It's a wetland-focused program. We know that that globally 40% of the dragonfly species rely on wetlands. Or sorry, globally 40% of all species rely on wetlands, and dragonflies being an integral part of that food web. They provide very direct input into biodiversity loss. And loss of dragonfly habitat has a ripple effect with negative consequences for ecosystems. And climate change is also driving some species further north that may compete with our native species for that scarce resource. So kind of further argument that we need to keep as much of the habitat on the landscape that exists today as we can. One of the things that we focus on is the beef sector, and there's a reason why we're so focused on the beef sector. It's because while they may only control 33% of the agricultural land is managed for beef production, they have almost 70% of the wildlife habitat in the country. So there's 52 million acres of grassland in Canada, and much of it is sustainably managed by cattle farmers and ranchers. And in those 52 million acres, we estimate there's about 1.6 million acres of wetlands, again, being used to raise livestock, which is a critical area for us to focus on. And then again, we've touched on this already, the policy discussion and the need for real policy, not just for grasslands, but for wetlands. We need those protocols to monetize the environmental goods and services that our land managers are having. There's money on the table there for farms and ranches to take advantage of, to monetize the areas that are otherwise viewed as wasteland. And so that's an area that people like me are focused on, trying to develop that market and working with our policy people to get there. And then I think this slide lays out kind of a good reason why we need to incorporate wetland benefits into public policy. It does lead to more efficient decision making. We can avoid overuse loss and ensure the sustainability of the resource. And then again, it's not about being anti-development. It's about being smart in how we develop, where we develop, not demonizing practices of the past. When it comes to land management, we certainly know a lot more today than than 100 years ago when the Regina Plains were starting to be plowed in. And let's make the best decisions moving forward to protect our markets, protect our resource, protect the wildlife, and protect the farming sector as well. There's an embedded interest here for farmers, and we need this at a landscape level. So another reason, like, why is Ducks working on policy? The short answer is we can't influence enough land on our own. We don't have that ability. We need to have landscape level policy discussions. One of the things that drives me bonkers is when we talk about an individual wetland and not the broader network of wetlands. Because an individual piece, very small, very insignificant in the big picture. We need to be talking at a 30,000 foot level, if you will. And then just one of the programs here quickly is our Marginal Areas program, where we know this is a map of a farm field, and the red areas are unprofitable, where there's profit or where there's loss of income, and just targeting those areas for retirement does a whole bunch of good for beneficial insects, nutrient management. We're not putting nutrients into an area that's going to be flooded out with a summer rain and wash those nutrients away. And the farmer's going to just immediately start making more money because they're not losing money on these areas. And in this map, in the southeast corner, if north is up, you've got a nice block there that you could square off, and then it avoids the issue of having to go around a wetland or grassland in your field, which increases the efficiency for the farmer as they're farming, but does provide some habitat value back on the landscape. And recognizing the red spots in the middle of the field are probably going to remain red for the efficiency use of the farmer to go around the field. And then just the last slide here, just kind of hammering that grasslands and wetlands are really punching above their weight. They're two of the most biodiverse ecozones, and where the two meet is one of the most biodiverse zones in the riparian area there. Beneficial insects, other predators aid with yields, value in natural areas. The same amount of carbon is stored by implementing zero-till on a quarter section of cropland for 25 years, or by protecting only 4 acres of wetlands. I think we should do both. I think zero-till is an important tool, but we shouldn't be plowing in a bunch of habitat and then zero-tilling. I think we need to examine how we're thinking there. And having natural areas embedded in cropland has shown an increase to yield. So again, I think there's value there for that. And with that, I think I think we'll call her good there, Chuck.
Thanks, Mike. Another great presentation. So that sort of concludes the panelist discussion that we've had. I'm not seeing any questions at this time, and for the sake of time, we'll continue to move